I see that there could have been equivalents to those artists in this country. But the fact is that the British turned their back on this kind of sacred beauty, and so turned away from the great traditions of European religious art. We followed our own idiosyncratic course and created another kind of beauty. Our triumphs in art would be distinctively our own. The story of art in Britain amounts to an autobiography of the nation. But like all autobiographies, it isn't entirely trustworthy. It's the devious work of a split personality. Some pages have been lost, torn out or burned, and whole chapters have been made to disappear. But traces still remain if you look in the right places.
Stories full of gaps are often the most revealing ones, and nothing says more about British culture than the holes that have been punched into the fabric of its past. A radical act of censorship lies at the centre of the history of art in Britain. That's why this story has to begin with an ending: the violent destruction of traditions of painting and sculpture which had flourished for centuries.
This is the Lady Chapel in Ely Cathedral. "200 years after it had been lovingly carved out by masons and sculptors, another group of men armed with hammers and chisels came in and smashed it up. The walls are forlorn, with headless bodies, stone torsos with missing arms and legs. But far more of the destruction is now invisible. All the freestanding statues have been pulled down, and we'll never know what they looked like. The British Middle Ages have become the missing ages. This violence wasn't mindless. The breaking of images, or iconoclasm, had a logic and a starting point. It began with the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII. In 1534, Henry declared himself the head of a new church, the Church of England, and broke with the authority of the Pope. Britain became an island, emotionally as well as geographically. It was no longer part of a pan-European Catholic culture, a culture which stretched from Dunfermline to Beirut. This violent reforming of the old Catholic faith continued under Henry's son Edward VI and his daughter Elizabeth I. Iconoclasm was the official policy of the Church of England, spearheaded by its radical hierarchy, men like Archbishop Cranmer and Bishops Latimer and Ridley.
Here at Ely, you can still feel the violent hatred of religious art that swept through the British Isles in the 16th and 17th centuries. The process of destruction has been called the Reformation, but what a tame, safely historical word that is for what went on here. This was nothing less than a cultural revolution.
The violence of that revolution has echoed right through our history. We're still living with the aftershock. We've always had a love-hate relationship with art, and hate triumphed here. Bishop West's chantry was completed in about 1530, shortly before the start of the Reformation, which means that the men who originally carved the statues for it lived to see their own work being destroyed. The religious arena was now out of bounds to artists. At a time when most art was religious art, this was tantamount to outlawing art itself. These scarred walls could have been made good, but instead the ghostly traces of carvings have been deliberately, aggressively left in place. Abstracts of the human figure, hacked and gouged almost flat to the wall. The men with hammers insisted these mutilated figures remain in place for all the world to see, like corpses exhibited after an execution. Over a century later, the iconoclasts were still at work. The images in these windows in Wells Cathedral were smashed, and now only remain as jumbled fragments, rather like a Kandinsky or a Cubist canvas in glass. They were attacked by Oliver Cromwell's army during the English Civil War in the 1640s. I wish I had £1 for every time a cathedral guide has told me about Cromwell and the damage his drunken soldiers did. In fact, they were only responsible for the tail end of Reformation destruction, certainly not the bulk of it. They were merely finishing off the good work of the Church of England. Subsequently, the Anglican establishment, as if embarrassed by all the destruction carried out in its name, attempted to lay as much blame as possible on Cromwell and Puritan extremism. And that's the version of events that's passed into folklore.
I came across an abbey that was crumbled all to bits. It looked a relic of a bygone day. A gentleman said, "What is this?" I said, "Excuse me, sir, I'll tell you all about it, if I may. It's a bit of a ruin that Cromwell knocked about a bit. One that Oliver Cromwell knocked about a bit. In the gay old days, there used to be some doings. No wonder that the poor old abbey went to ruins. Those who studied history sing and shout of it. And you can bet your life there ain't a doubt of it."
By Cromwell's time, after over 100 years of iconoclasm, the sound of hammering had been heard not just in the cathedrals and monasteries, but in every parish church in the land. It's ironic that the country church should have become a reassuring symbol of continuity in Britain. Few places have been subjected to as much violent change as our churches. Churches are the battlefields on which a war for the soul of the nation was fought. And churches provide the key to the entire story of British art. We're often said to be a literary rather than a visual people, but the art that has survived inside these buildings, battered and fragmented as it is, proves that Britain was once a profoundly visual culture. Too crude to be a masterpiece, but crude enough to be unforgettable, this is one of the very few surviving medieval paintings of the Last Judgment. The Wenneston Doom, in the parish church of Wenneston, in Suffolk. The picture makes no concessions to artistry. It was painted on boards joined together by makeshift carpentry, and would have provided the painted backdrop to Christ's crucifixion. You can see the outline of where the cross would have been. The message of the Doom is straightforward. Thou shalt be afraid. If I was a 15th century peasant, I think I'd find it pretty frightening. The artist has painted hell as a fish, rapaciously consuming the damned. The horrors of hell are what stay with you, a demonic imprint on the imagination. The spectator didn't gaze on a picture like the Wenneston Doom for pleasure.
In fact, he or she wasn't really a spectator at all in the modern sense. Art then wasn't art as we understand it now. Art was one of the most important forms of instruction in a society where hardly anyone knew how to read. Art was an aid to prayer and to meditation, a way of helping people to imagine heaven and hell, and of helping them to find the way to salvation through faith and good works. Art was like a signpost to the next world, placed in this one.
In its own direct way, the Doom brings Christian belief alive. Too alive for the reformers, who would have seen it as tawdry, superstitious propaganda, papal trash in their own phrase. They whitewashed the picture over in 1549. It was forgotten about for more than 300 years, and was eventually taken out into the graveyard as junk to be burned. It survives thanks to a sudden rainfall one day in 1892, which washed off the white paint, revealing once again heaven and hell, and St. Michael weighing up who'd be damned and who'd be saved, with their names written in the Book of Life. The depth and intimacy of the relationship which once existed between the British and the images in their lives can be felt when you look through the antiphona belonging to St. Helen's Ranworth, a 15th century church in Norfolk built and decorated on the profits of the local wool industry. The tiny paintings in this beautiful East Anglian illuminated manuscript brilliantly interweave faith and imagination. Delicate as they are, they unself-consciously picture the greatest mysteries of the Christian faith as events which could have taken place just around the corner. In the miniature devoted to the Ascension, we see Jesus Christ rising into heaven from the top of a green hill. Only his feet are visible, and he has left his footprints on the grass. In the same book, we find Jonah being disgorged, not by a whale, but what looks like a great white shark, or perhaps a very large pike on the Norfolk Broads, which can be seen from the church tower. Such homely depictions of the miraculous existed to persuade. Yes, they say, these miracles really happened, and they happened to people as real as you, in places as real as here. The church contains one of the most beautiful surviving examples of the carved and painted screen, the rood screen as it's called, which was once such an important part of the Catholic faith in Britain. The screen's function was partly theatrical. It separated the congregation from the altar at the far end of the church, thus enhancing the sense of mystery and drama associated with the Mass. The rood screen was also traditionally the most richly decorated part of the church.
There's a tremendous amount of local variation within British medieval art, and the work here is much more sophisticated and self-conscious than the Wenneston Doom painting. The figures are painted in much richer colours, golds and greens and blues, ground up from semi-precious stones.
They are also drawn more elegantly by an artist with a sophisticated sense of design and colour. The richness of the fabrics worn by the figures may represent a certain amount of local pride, subtly suggesting the heights to which manufacturers of the real textiles could rise here in East Anglia. Artists of the time did not sign their work, because art wasn't thought of as self-expression, but the expression of God's purposes. The rood in rood screen means cross. Once, on top of every screen in the country, there would have been one great image above all the others, the focus of the whole church, a larger-than-life-size statue of the crucified Christ. The top of the screen, or loft, would have been lit with candles, so the stairs would have been in constant use. They're redundant now, because there's no crucifix to hold a candle to anymore. Not one complete Christ has survived anywhere in the country. But there is a clue to what they might once have been like in the church of St Andrew in Columpton, a small town in Devon. It contains one of the most extraordinary objects I've ever seen. There's a hint of what's to come on the outside.
This is one of the very few surviving remains of the great carved Christs. It's the base of what was once a very large sculpture of the crucifixion. And what it represents is the landscape at the foot of the cross, the stony, skull-littered ground of Golgotha. It's an almost primitive-looking thing, but that's its power. It goes straight to the heart of the most stark and timeless human emotion.
Only a part of what it once was. A statue of Christ on the cross would have been slotted into this square hole, with the figures of Mary and John either side, and the whole thing would originally have been placed up on the rood screen. God knows what it must have looked like in its appropriate context, towering above the congregation. Now little more than a curiosity at the back of the church, it's fallen into the black hole of amnesia and ignorance shared by so much British medieval art. Hidden away in the City of London, one almost intact stone figure of Christ does survive. It was found underneath the Mercer's Hall in the 1950s by workmen. It's not Christ on the cross, but in the tomb. It's never been seen by the public. Created in the early 16th century, on the cusp of a British Renaissance that was never to be, the realism of this great carving is mesmerising. The muscles and tendons in the legs have been spasmed by the cramps and agonies of crucifixion. He has just breathed his last. The light of the world has gone out before the miracle of the resurrection. When I look at it lying on the boardroom floor of the Mercer's Hall, I see two deaths, that of Christ in his agony and that of an entire tradition of carving in this country. In St Mary's Priory Church, Abergavenny, one other unquestionably great figurative sculpture has survived from the pre-Reformation past. It too is virtually unknown. It's never been filmed before, and as far as I know, nothing has ever been written about it. It's a figure of Jesse, father of David, ancestor of Jesus Christ, and it was carved out of the entire trunk of an oak tree sometime between 1490 and 1510. Jesse, in the theology of medieval Catholicism, is thought of as the root from which Christ will grow. The severed stump that projects upwards from the figure's groin was once a support or base for other carvings, twisting and growing up the wall to reach their climax in a carving of Christ's life, death, and resurrection. These collective objects were called Jesse trees. This isn't just the most impressive wooden figure to survive the bonfires of the Reformation in Wales. As far as I'm concerned, it's one of the greatest sculptures of the world. It's got the power and spirituality of Italian Quattrocento painting, but translated into weighty sculptural form. Traces of paint indicate how exotic he must once have been. There's something mysterious and occult about this prophet from the East. Perhaps there's still an echo in this figure of oak of the ancient pagan tree cults that were once so strong in this part of Wales.
If it hadn't been for the Reformation, there might now be a standard term for work such as this, early Welsh Renaissance perhaps. But the fact is that this is a work of art for which there are virtually no frames of reference. Because everything else like it's been destroyed, it's an object without a history, a wonderful oddity.
This is all that's left of a great stone figure of Jesse. Here in St Cuthbert's, Wells, it's the reverse of Abergavenny. Jesse doesn't survive, but the rest of his tree, the figures which once grew out of his side and populated this stone framework, do. They are not in terribly good shape. Having been hacked to pieces by the reformers in the 1560s, the fragments were then swept up by an anonymous sympathiser and stored away in the hope that one day the jigsaw puzzle of their original beauty would be put back together and the statues displayed again. They're still waiting. If you didn't know they were English, you might think these sculptures, with their marvellously preserved paint, were fragments from some ancient Greek temple. Because so little survives, and because what does is so various, from Aztec to Hellenistic, it's difficult to define the essence of British medieval art. That said, there is one strain running throughout, and there's a good example of it on the outside of the church that once housed the stone Jesse. Grinning gargoyles and deformed, weird creatures might be marginal to theological doctrine, but they were a constant presence in church art. The British were particularly noted for such images and influenced the rest of Europe. There's a word for this carnivalesque British art form: baboonery.
There's a spirit of baboonery running right through British culture, an anarchy lodged at the heart of the national imagination. The irrepressible characters invented by Chaucer and Shakespeare are the greatest literary examples. But this dangerous capacity of the British mind is most visible in art. It's there in Hogarth's dark world of grotesques, in the strange mutants dreamed up by the cartoonist James Gilray, and in the screaming, distorted heads painted by Francis Bacon. This powerful strain of excess, of grotesquerie, certainly has its origins in British medieval art.
This dangerous capacity of the British imagination may also, at least in part, have been responsible for the vigour of the backlash against it. The very act of destroying works of art was itself sometimes done with the same kind of high-spirited excess as the babboonery. The forerunners of English Protestantism, the 15th century Lollards, had been known to singe beards onto statues and images of the Virgin Mary. Subversive gestures against art, which predict 20th century acts of irreverence, like Marcel Duchamp drawing a moustache onto the Mona Lisa. The medieval vision was at its most stunning and unconstrained in the cathedrals, which were the great set pieces of the Catholic faith. The cathedral was a bridge between this world and the next, the closest thing on earth to a vision of heaven itself. The cathedrals were made to be visible from miles away, great ships of salvation, with their towers and spires rising up into the sky like masts. We admire these buildings now for their daring and ingenuity. But you miss the point of them when you see them in purely structural terms. Today, these statues are bleached ghosts of their former selves. For before the Reformation, they were ablaze with colour. The cathedral front would have looked like a vast illuminated manuscript page raised into the sky. Archaeologists have analysed hundreds of tiny medieval paint samples found on the statues on the west front of Exeter Cathedral. Under the microscope, you can see the boldness of the colours which once gave each statue a vivid character of its own. The idea of painting statues seems vulgar now to a lot of people, but the effect didn't have to be garish at all. Inside Exeter Cathedral, the late 13th century tomb of Bishop Bronscombe still has all its original paint. Fantastically delicate effects could be obtained. The fine gradations of golds and greens in the folds of the drapery reveal a sophisticated sense of light and shade. Painting statues was a whole art in itself, and helped to emphasize the three-dimensionality of a sculpture. But the art of the cathedral was not designed for the silent admiration of the connoisseur. Once, polyphonic walls of sound would have emitted from these galleries on high. Cathedrals were like theatres of religion, wreathed with the smoke of incense, filled with noise and colour. There would have been dancing as well as praying, and on the great feast days there would have been plays and processions. Concealed behind these angels in the minstrels' gallery were singers. Their voices, as if coming down to earth from heaven, would have blasted through these specially constructed openings. Intoxication by spectacle and music was the purpose of the cathedral. It was a place of swooning, passionate belief. It was this world, full of light and colour and sound, that the reformers set out to stifle, to silence, and to smash. This church in the village of Withersdale Street in Suffolk encapsulates all that the Protestant reformers believed in. It's a white cube, devoid of all paraphernalia. How empty it all is. All that's left of the rood screen is this staircase going nowhere. This was the brave new world envisaged by the reformers.
Withersdale is only a few miles away from the church at Wennerston with its painted doom. But here we see a different kind of doom, the doom of the whole world of Catholicism in Britain after last judgment had been passed upon it by the reforming Protestants of the 16th and 17th centuries. This is a place that has been purged and purified, stripped of image and relic and every last vestige of popish superstition.
With the Mass outlawed, the altar lost its mystique and was now much more like an ordinary table. To an Englishman or woman used to the customs and appearances of the old faith, it would have been revolutionary. In this reformed functional church, the 10 Commandments were just as much the centre of attention. The Catholic Church had softened the impact of the second commandment, which forbids the worship of graven images, by running it into the first. But the Protestants restored it to the status of a separate commandment, to underline their belief that graven images cluttered up their relationship with God.
Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them. Josiah began to purge Judah and Jerusalem from the high places and the groves and the carved images and the molten images. And they break down the altars of Balaam in his presence, and the images that were on high above them he cut down, and the groves and the carved images and the molten images he brake in pieces, and made dust of them, and strawed it upon the graves of them that had sacrificed unto them. And he burnt the bones of the priest upon their altars, and cleansed Judah and Jerusalem.
Many a graphic verse in the Bible served as blueprints for Protestant image breaking, and iconoclastic kings of Judea like Josiah provided role models. The Jews were taught to beware of veering into idolatrous practices within their own religion, as well as to beware of whoring after the strange gods of neighbouring tribes. In the eyes of the reformers, papal Rome became associated with the conspicuous luxury and decadence of ancient Babylon, with the worst excesses of idolatry, and with the Antichrist. Catholic ritual was seen as a form of superstition, where the veneration of images degenerated into their open worship, displacing the worship due to God alone. The Mass was dismissed as an act of trickery, mumbo-jumbo which took in the congregation, making monkeys of them. The determination to rid Britain of all this jiggery popery, as they called it, was the driving force behind iconoclasm.
Iconoclasm wasn't invented in Britain, but it was carried much further here than anywhere else. The destruction of art that took place in other Protestant countries, like Switzerland or Holland, was much more sporadic and much less thorough. In Britain, the leaders of the newly established church pursued their iconoclastic policies with blanket efficiency. It's hard to be precise, but between 95% and 99% of all religious art was destroyed.
In Scotland, where the Reformation was particularly effective, not even 1% survived. The new Protestant clergy saw the purging of images as the purifying of people's minds. The methods of destruction chosen were deliberately charged with the idea of purification. Whitewash was one. Another was fire. Hundreds of wooden images were turned into vast public bonfires. Jolly musters, as Archbishop Cranmer called them. These events were morale-boosting acts of Protestant propaganda, and a new kind of spectacle to replace the Catholic ceremonies of old. There's something fetishistic about iconoclasm which goes to such great lengths. The amount of time and energy spent destroying an image is still time devoted to that image. You're perversely recognizing its status. The Protestants protested a bit too much, as if deep down they feared the image, feared its evil eye. Eyes are what give images life, so the iconoclasts would make a point of gouging out the eyes of the objects they so hated. They deface them too, literally take their faces off, in order to take away their power to respond and gaze back as if human. These blinded saints are on the rood screen of St Edmund's, Southwold, in Suffolk, one of the stamping grounds of William Dowsing, a Puritan iconoclast of the 1640s who kept a journal or ledger.
Southwold, April the 8th. We break down 130 superstitious pictures, St Andrew, and 4 crosses on the 4 corners of the vestry, and gave order to take down 13 cherubim, and take down 20 angels, and to take down the cover of the font. Ufford, August the 31st. And we break down the organ cases and gave them to the poor.
With hindsight, the progress of the Reformation in Britain seems to have been relentless, but there were pockets of local resistance. There are many stories of doors locked against the destroyers, of bands of devout women joining together to bar the entrances to their churches, of treasured images buried or hidden against the day when the Catholic faith might, just might, return. Most of the art that survives in Britain from the Middle Ages was saved in this way.
There is a glorious cover over the font, like a pope's triple crown, with a pelican on the top, picking its breast, all gilt over with gold. And we were kept out of the church above 2 hours, and neither church wardens, William Brown nor Roger Small, that were enjoined these things above 3 months afore, had not done them in May.
This huge font cover in the Church of St Mary in Ufford in Suffolk would have given the baptism service great significance and solemnity. This cover still operates on its original medieval counterweights. Imagine it being lifted up and the child being placed beneath it. The whole weight of the Catholic Church was there, both protecting and bearing down on its fragile head. Naturally, font covers were prime targets for the reformers. But it seems that the Ufford parishioners had other ideas about the fate of the one in their church.
And they would not let him have the key. And now neither the church wardens, nor William Brown, nor the constable James Tokerlove, and William Gardiner the sexton, would not let us have the key in 2 hours' time.
The Ufford font cover survived, but all the others in this part of East Anglia, not to mention countless other objects, didn't. They only exist as entries in Dowsing's ghoulish account of how he swept down on parish after parish.
Stradbroke, April the 4th. 8 angels off the roof, and cherubim in wood to be taken down, and 4 crosses on the steeple, and 1 on the church, and 1 on the porch, and 17 pictures in the upper window, and pray for such out of your charity, and organs which I break. At Clare, January the 6th. We break down 1,000 pictures superstitious. I break down 200. February the 3rd, Wenham Parva. We break down 26 superstitious pictures and gave order to break down 6 more, and to level the steps. February the 3rd, Wenham Magna. There was nothing to reform. Copdock, January the 29th, did deface a cross on the font, and gave order to take down a stone.
Behind Dowsing's boastful litany, we can hear the fabric of medieval culture going, gone, under the hammer of a new faith. His vandalism was evangelism.
The Reformation is often said to mark the moment when the British ceased being visually aware, when they became a nation of Vandals and Philistines. But to visit Withersdale is to see that exposed as a lie, or at least a profound mistake. This might be a place built on the rejection of imagery. It might be a place from which all carving and painting and stained glass have been excluded. It might be a place where the word rules, naked and shining in the bright light of truth. But it's also beautiful to look at.
This whiteness is the whiteness of idealism. It's the whiteness of a faith which, through the Bible, taught ordinary people to read, a democratic whiteness. It's the whiteness of a faith built on the killing of old superstitions. It's a rational whiteness, and it will become the whiteness of scientific inquiry, the whiteness of the hospital and the anatomy theatre. It's the whiteness of a questioning, challenging faith. It's also a dangerous whiteness, a whiteness made to praise God, but which may end up by questioning his very existence.
But having cut themselves off from their past and from Europe, the British also turned their backs on their own dangerous radicalism. The radical vision behind the purity of the white cube would be shunned. But that same vision would be developed and pushed into a national style of art in another place, at another time, by another English-speaking people.
America was the nation produced out of the failure of the Puritan moment in England. It was founded when the extremists of the British Cultural Revolution, like the Mayflower Pilgrims, departed across the Atlantic to build their brave new world. It would take America 3 centuries to rediscover its own radical origins, in the form of art. It did so triumphantly in the work created by the New York School and their followers between the end of the Second World War and the early 1970s. This is the final destination of an aesthetic first pioneered by radical clerics in 16th and 17th century England. There's a recognition of the link in the titles so many American painters of the post-war period gave to their emptied-out pictures. Whitewashed or blacked-out canvases with grandiose biblical titles like Abraham and Eve and the Word. These objects were exhibited most often inside the pure white cube of the modern art gallery, that intimidating secular parody of a Puritan church. It seems eccentric to think of pictures like these as modern art. After all, they're so nostalgic for the 17th century, and for the fiercely anti-image Mosaic law, and the 10 Commandments which so inspired the early Protestants. Many of these American abstract artists, like Barnett Newman, were Jewish and would have been very aware of the ancient Judaic distrust of idols and images. The American art that followed the Newmans and the Rothkos and the Reinhardts was, if anything, even more akin to the old spaces of Puritan worship. American artists invented conceptual art, word art. The pure white cube was embellished with text. American artists have more of a sense of history than they're generally credited with. When this work by Lawrence Weiner was first exhibited in 1973, it was hailed as the last word in modernism. But it's really just the 10 Commandments, up on the church wall, all over again. In Britain, the history of art would not take the American course, nor would it develop in line with the great European tradition. It would follow another, more idiosyncratic route. It was the strange fate, not just of the British artist, but of the British people, to be torn forever between desire for the future and inability to forget the past. The best place to understand this national dichotomy will always be in church. Here in the Black Mountains of Wales there's plenty of whitewash, but an image too. A grim reaper, etched in oxblood, that seeps through into the 20th century from the back of beyond.
This church at Patricio is neither one thing nor another, and that gives it its own significance. Some conflicts are never resolved, and the Reformation was one of them. You can try to smother the old fears and needs. You can try to abolish the past. But no matter how many layers of white paint are applied, the image will always find a way of coming back to haunt the British imagination.
Next Sunday, the battle between realism and fantasy, a history of British art, continues at 7:30 here on BBC Two.